try to post these to our Renewable Energy Working Group YouTube page. So if you miss any of those, you can catch them on the YouTube page. But I'm really excited to be a member of this working group, and in general, just a member of TWS, and to be presenting.
Hello, Quinn. I'm Jared. I don't think we've worked together before.
Hi, Jared.
Hey, if we could have everyone mute on their computers, that would be super helpful for me. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. But yeah, so I've been a member of TWS since about 2016, when I was a graduate student. And so I always really valued all of the sort of content that TWS put on. So I'm excited to be here. So like I mentioned, I work for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies on their energy and wildlife portfolio. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that we've been doing over the past couple of years in the renewable energy sphere. First and foremost, I want to start off with giving you a background of who AFWA is. I'll be honest, when I started with AFWA about a year ago, I had no idea who AFWA was. Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. I kind of assumed they were a government agency. But we're not. We're a non-governmental organization, and we're essentially the trade organization for fish and wildlife agencies. And we represent North America's fish and wildlife agencies to promote and advance sound science, and to help with management and conservation of fish and wildlife in the public interest. So it's the responsibility of the Fish and Wildlife Agencies to manage public lands. This is what's called the public trust doctrine, or the North American model. So it's our responsibility to help state fish and wildlife agencies manage lands in the best interest of what the public needs. And so we do this sort of working at this national scale. So we represent state agency members on Capitol Hill and before the administration to try to advance favorable fish and wildlife conservation policy and conservation funding. And then we really work to make sure that all these different entities, federal, state, NGO, industry, and the like, are working collaboratively on really important issues. We also provide our member agencies with coordination services on a whole host of topics. So renewable energy is just one of the many things that we do. We work on birds, we work on fish habitat, climate change, wildlife action plans, conservation education, leadership training, and we're even involved in some international relations as well. So we like to provide communication, collaboration opportunities, trainings, capacity building, and just really try to do whatever we can to support state fish and wildlife agencies. Now, we're actually made up of a lot of different sort of, we have a lot of different organizations sort of under the AFWA umbrella that just highlight how sort of how far our reach extends in helping promote fish and wildlife conservation. So, you know, the management assistant team is under AFWA. So this is these are educators that work to train fish and wildlife agencies in management and leadership training. We also have Project Wild. So this is going to be more of a primary school education. So doing nature-based education for kids. It's a really great program. The National Conservation Leadership Institute, NCLI, that's actually part of the AFWA umbrella. So this is an intensive year-long course that trains you in conservation leadership. We hold the state seat for the Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. We staff the NABC, or the North American Bird Conservation Initiative. There's lots of fun alphabet soup going on here, as we all know. And the National Fish Habitat Partnership, as well as BearWise, are all parts of AFWA. And I want to just draw some particular attention right now to the Alliance for America's Fish and Wildlife. And this is essentially the campaign for Recovering America's Wildlife Act, or RAWA. This is a legislation that would fund conservation efforts for more than 12,000 species of greatest conservation need, or SCGN, that are outlined in every state's wildlife action plan. And so, you know, right now, most of Fish and Wildlife Agency's funding comes through the Pittman-Robertson Act, which it takes excise tax from ammunition and firearms, and then, of course, with hunting and fishing licenses. So that's where most fish and wildlife agencies get their funding from. And so a lot of the resources that these agencies have go back into managing those game species. With RAWA, this would open up a lot of funding for those non-game species that continue to be in peril. We need to be sure that we're doing proactive conservation and not reactive, and the funding from RAWA would do that. And how the bill's written right now is that it's actually would dedicate 1.4 billion, that's with a B, of dedicated appropriated annual funding for proactive on the ground efforts across the country, and that money would go to fish and wildlife agencies and to tribes. Last year, we got super close to getting that passed. It passed the House and then almost got into the end of the year omnibus package. And this year, it didn't quite make it. But this year, it's been, for this Congress at least, it's been reintroduced into the Senate right now, and they're working on getting co-sponsorship. So keep your ear to the ground for that. And we're always looking for extra supporters and people who are interested in just getting involved in that, because this would be a pretty game-changing piece of legislation. Okay, so that's sort of high level. AFWA does a whole lot of things with the overarching goal of supporting state fish and wildlife agencies. The way we work is we're considered a committee-driven organization. So there are certain organizations that are staff-driven, state agencies are staff-driven, but the way that AFWA works, we're committee-driven. So we have all these different committees that cover different topics. You can see here amphibian and reptile conservation, invasive species, fish and wildlife trust fund committee. So we have a whole bunch of different committees, and they're all working on different things. And these committees are chaired most typically by a state agency director. And then the members of the committees are other state agency representatives. We have NGOs, we have federal partners, and even some industry partners. So it's through the work of these committees that is how AFWA really gets things done. And so the committee the work that I'm going to be talking a little bit more about today happens under is the Energy and Wildlife Policy Committee. This is a committee that's focused on energy development and generation in North America, and how that impacts fish and wildlife resources and their landscapes at multiple different scales. This committee was originally developed to sort of tackle all different types of energy, traditional oil and gas and renewables. But with the recent goals of the administration and sort of just the general inflection point that we're at when it comes to our energy, that we're sort of shifting away from oil and gas and moving towards renewables, this committee has really taken a leadership role in helping state agencies with renewable development. So like I mentioned, we are expecting this huge build out of wind and solar. This is from the Princeton Net Zero America study. I just think it's a really impactful estimation of how much wind and solar build out we're going to have to see by 2050 to reach the administration's goals of a net zero economy by 2050. So towards these goals, again, AFWA really kind of wanted to get ahead of things and really understand what are some of the challenges that state agencies are facing. And we started off with tackling that with wind. And so under the Energy and Wildlife Policy Committee, we established the Wind Wildlife Working Group. And through this working group, we just wanted to figure out, what are states dealing with and how can we help, and what are priorities, and where can we go from here? So what they did in 2019, this was before my tenure, but they sent out a wind sighting and wildlife survey to all 50 states to get a sense of what are the challenges that you're facing and what do you need. So I'll sort of high level highlight what we found here. First and foremost, we found that there's a pretty big gap in the way that developers are communicating with state fish and wildlife agencies. So there tends to not be a whole lot of communication, and it's really just not consistent with the type of communication that state agencies would like to see from the developer. So getting developers to talk to state agencies can be really, really challenging. Also, in general, we found that there's a lack of interest by developers on species of greatest conservation need. Instead, developers and other project proponents are primarily concerned with those federally endangered or state endangered that sort of have that federal nexus or regulatory nexus attached to them. And the other big finding that we had was that there's two-way data sharing is limited. So state agencies, all of their data they try to make readily available, but there doesn't seem to be as much two-way data. So if the project is sharing or is collecting monitoring data, for example, at a wind facility, it's really challenging to get those data back to the state agencies so that they can actually have some data to manage off of. So based off of the findings of this wind survey, we had a couple of recommendations. The first recommendation is to enhance interstate coordination. And this is sort of the crux of what AFWA tries to do. We really want to make sure that states are talking to each other. So for example, in the case of wind, we know that Texas has been developing wind for a lot longer than a lot of other states. So if other states can figure out, if they can talk to Texas and be like, hey, we're facing this issue, what did you guys do? And create those open lines of communication, it can really help with having more streamlined and consistent management. And I will say, at the time that this survey was put out, there was not a person in my role. So I am forever grateful for this survey because it actually asked for AFWA to hire a full-time person in this role. And I'm the lucky sucker who got the job. But I'm so incredibly grateful for that. All right, so second recommendation is to enhance collaboration with state agencies, industry, and NGO. So again, there's a lot of people doing a lot of different things out there when it comes to wind. And let's all collaborate and figure out how to do it together. The final recommendation was more of a recommendation for what the future research should look like in the wind space. And state agencies saw a need for more research on cumulative impacts, population level impacts, and species behavior as being those key research areas. So we published this survey results as a report on the AFWA website, and then they decided to take it one step further and get it published in the Wildlife Professional. So if you're interested in sort of the full readout, you can find it in the Wildlife Professional. You can also find it on the AFWA website. Okay, so this Wind Wildlife Working Group, we're still very active. We've moved on from the survey, and we're now trying to do sort of more actionable things that get at some of these recommendations. But as we all know, solar energy is increasingly popular, more abundant source of energy that's being developed out in the United States. Currently, solar provides about 4% of the US electrical supply, and it is a key role in the administration's decarbonization goals. And according to the US Department of Energy Solar Futures Study, solar energy is estimated to supply as much as 40% of US electricity by 2035. And the projections are that would take about 5.7 million acres. And so there's going to be a lot of solar buildup across the landscape, which means that probably a lot of it might be happening on state lands or lands that state agencies are managing. So we really wanted to figure out, what are states dealing with? Are we starting to see this? How can we prepare you if your state hasn't already begun to see solar build out? So towards that goal, the Energy and Wildlife Policy Committee established the Solar Wildlife Working Group. And just the goal of the Solar Working Group was similar to the Wind Working Group: figure out what states are dealing with and try to help them sort of deal with these issues. So we followed suit with what the Wind Wildlife Working Group did, and we developed a survey to try to just get at some of these questions. And so we sent the survey out and got results back at the end of 2021. We got a response rate from 41 states, which actually represented about 92% of the total installed capacity in the United States. So we felt that this was a really good representation of states that were dealing with solar. And so this map here shows you in the darker orange which states did respond. We also realized as we were sort of going through the results that maybe doing a national level assessment or analysis of these results might not be the best scale to look at these things like we did with wind. So with wind, most of the wind resources is in the middle of the United States, and there's not a whole lot of difference when it comes to sort of the habitats that we're dealing with. When it comes to solar, you know, the desert Southwest is incredibly different from the northeastern part of the United States. We're dealing with completely different habitats, entirely different species and ecosystems. So maybe looking at this from the national scale isn't the best resolution here. So we decided to actually look at it from a regional perspective. And we sort of kind of started to follow the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regions. We combined a couple of areas to maintain state anonymity in their responses. But the blue outlines represent the different regions that we analyze the results at. So as I go through some of these results today, you'll see that I'm presenting both national and then where appropriate, sort of where the regions were different. Okay, so with that, let's dive into some of these results. So first and foremost, over 70% of respondents believed that the risk to wildlife habitat posed by solar can sometimes be substantial. And it was found at a national scale that grassland and prairies were ranked at highest risk in all regions, except in the Southeast. In the Southeast, agriculture was ranked as the most at-risk habitat with respect to solar. Also at a national scale, the respondents said that habitat fragmentation is the biggest concern that we have when it comes to solar. The table here below shows the geographic breakdown. So this is basically outside of habitat fragmentation. These were the biggest issues that these regions are worried about. So permanent and temporary impact, species displacement, invasive species, and migration barriers all came up as really, really critical concerns for the states. So next we wanted to get into, you know, sort of communication and regulatory authorities of the states. And the vast majority of states, unfortunately, don't have a whole lot of regulatory powers and instead have to rely on voluntary approaches to encourage low impact siting. So really what they have to do, what many of these states have to do is just encourage that a project proponent consults with a state agency, you know, most importantly, pre-construction, but also throughout construction. You can see that there's a couple of exceptions here. So in the Pacific West, we actually have states that require solar project proponents to secure siting approval for construction. So that's pretty impressive that they're required to go through the state agency. That again, that's very, very rare. And then also in the Pacific West, we see that state agencies they do require developers to coordinate with the agency on potential impacts. But the vast majority of states, that's not true. They have to rely almost exclusively on voluntary approaches, and they can just encourage avoidance, minimization, and offsetting. So when it comes to sort of queuing in on that early coordination or process, which is really, really critical for states. And again, what we're referring to with early coordination is when a developer or project proponent reaches out to a state agency, sort of even before boots on the ground, even potentially before even a desktop analysis, to hear, you know, the thoughts of the agency when it comes to wildlife and habitat concerns. So while state agencies try to have a lot of their, you know, spatial data online that outline where a species of concern or habitat of concern might be, and you can, you know, a project proponent could potentially use, you know, overlay those layers with where their site is intended to be. Excuse me, it's always possible that some of those layers are out of date or there's new data that hasn't been included, or perhaps the state agency doesn't have the capacity to get data online. So it's super, super important for project proponents to actually just go have a conversation with the state agencies. However, unfortunately, this is not the case. We typically don't see this. You can see in this graph here that, you know, 36% at a national scale said that rarely does early coordination happen. And when it does happen, we ask states, what are project proponents asking for? And primarily, when they do reach out, when project proponents do reach out to a state agency, they're asking about the presence of a regulated species or habitat concerns, and then just general requests for information about species that might be of interest to the agency. So again, really, it seems like the only reason a project proponent might be reaching out to a state agency is to make sure that they're not on the hook for an endangered species or something that might have a regulatory nexus to it. And really what a state agency wants to do is manage all wildlife, not just the critically endangered, because if we're not managing for the critically endangered, then they might become endangered. So we also wanted to just get a sense of what kind of information can a state agency respond. I kind of alluded to this in the previously, what type of information a state agency can provide. And generally they can give, general geospatial siting tools, state siting guidelines or best management practices. Some states have certifications or scorecards for low impact projects. Some states even have PV solar specific geospatial siting tools rather than just sort of these more generic ones. A couple of states have model local ordinances for low impact siting. And then 2 states that responded have incentive programs. And so these are the types of information that a state agency could get if there was early coordination. Now, I'm not here to slight the industry in any way. As with anything, that there's good actors and there's bad actors. And we see this in the solar side of things. So we see that the frequency of that early coordination, it varies. There's a lot of really great developers out there who are really good at talking and coordinating with the agencies. And then of course, there's the ones that are not so. So I just think these are a couple of direct quotes from respondents that highlight that very well. So that the first, many of the developers go through the state agency, but their siting decisions are typically already made and they're just checking boxes. So I hear this a lot in my job when I'm talking to agencies is that, checking boxes is good. Those boxes are there for a reason, but to an extent, checking boxes is just that. It's just an exercise. Another quote, for those that consult, I've been pleasantly surprised about their willingness to make changes. And finally, it's difficult to know whether developers are following through with those recommended actions. So with state agencies, our sort of continual mantra is early and often communication. We want to hear from you early and we want to hear from you more often. So if you come to a state agency and maybe they give you feedback on, hey, maybe you could move this this solar facility, 20 miles north, because then we'll get out of this area. A lot of times the agencies have no idea if they've taken that feedback, if the developers have taken that feedback and what they're planning to do. So that early and often communication is so critical for state agencies. All right, so next we asked about pre and post construction data collection. Overall, we found that pre-construction monitoring occurs more frequently than post-construction, despite states saying that both pre and post-construction data are really helpful. Regionally, we found that the Pacific West was the only region where pre and post-construction monitoring data were always undertaken. But the majority of states in other regions say that post-construction at least is never done. I think, pre and post-construction monitoring is a debate that's going on right now, especially that post-construction data. Are we just counting dead things to count dead things? And I think that's, and states understand that, especially if we're not able to share that data in any meaningful way, then what are we actually doing with that monitoring data? And it seems like with solar sort of coming up online, this might be an interesting conversation to have, is to discuss that idea of post-construction data and how can we do something that's going to be useful for everyone. All right, so then finally we asked the states what were their greatest research needs, and the sort of top 5 here are listed. So we need research on birds, avoidance, minimization, and compensation for impacts. We need more research on the indirect impacts of PV solar, on wildlife habitat use, displacement, and behavior. We need more state of the science summaries on solar wildlife impacts. Just, right now there's a lot of disparate studies or studies that are kind of in the middle of happening or just starting up. So trying to figure out ways to put all of that information in one place so that these state agencies can manage more effectively. Best management practices was another big need for these state agencies, as well as understanding those effects of cumulative impacts. Other big topics that came up as big needs were understanding how big game movement might be affected, grassland birds, pollinators, PV maintenance regimens, and different fencing designs, and how that could help manage at a solar facility. So that was at the national scale. At the regional scale, there's just the Southwest and Pacific West had picked out a couple different needs. So in the Southwest, noted that they needed more wildlife fatality rates from development. And the Pacific West noted that best management practices for that post-construction monitoring would be really, really useful. All right, so those are the really high-level results of this survey. And from the results, we were able to develop about 6 different recommendations. And a lot of these recommendations echo the recommendations from the WIND survey. And so first and foremost, it's to ensure early coordination between project proponents and state agencies. So again, that gets at this early and often communication. Second recommendation, enhance interstate collaboration to promote consistency and learning opportunities. That's the primary goal that I'm trying to accomplish in my role and as a tenant of AFWA is to get those collaborations between states happening and make them effective. Our third major recommendation is to conduct additional research based off of the gaps and needs that were identified in the survey that I just mentioned. Fourth recommendation is to collect and share data between project proponents and state agencies. Number 5, provide relevant state level resources, including BMP, best management practice databases, GIS toolsets, guidelines, etc. And the final recommendation is to develop solar PV guidance, similar to the 2012 land-based wind energy guidelines. And most of the states think that those PV guidelines, those solar guidelines, should happen at the regional scale for the reasons that I mentioned in the past, that we're just dealing with completely different ecosystems, and perhaps a national level guidance isn't the best scale to be working at. So we have these recommendations from the Solar Wildlife Working Group, and we're actually now that again that working group is pivoting from getting the results and writing them up of this survey and pivoting into actually actionable outcomes from these recommendations. So right now, we have a task team that's working on pulling together a best management practices database from all the states. So combing through state agency websites, seeing if they've developed any sort of best management practice and putting that into sort of a searchable database that could be a one-stop shop for both agencies, but also developers. And we're doing a lot of actionable things towards these recommendations, again, all in the spirit of trying to support state agencies as they're dealing with increased solar development. So moving forward, again, sort of just a high level summary here is that we do need more information and research. I think a lot of us know that solar is pretty nascent in terms of our understanding of its effects on wildlife and habitats. But I think it's critically important for everyone to know that state fish and wildlife agencies are your partners. They are people who are dedicated to helping you, dedicated to helping make sure that they're conserving fish and wildlife in their habitat. So see them as partners, not as an impediment for everyone. That early and often, again, if you come to any AFWA meeting, you're going to hear everyone saying early and often. It's so incredibly important. Just that communication, building communication, even if you don't have anything to say, just letting, for a developer, letting an agency just know that you're thinking about this area. And then, then the agency can sort of get their ducks in a row to be able to make recommendations. Finally, we need a coordinated, multifaceted effort for the future of a responsible solar development across the nation. So, it's groups like AFWA where we try to pull together multiple stakeholders and try to tackle this from a lot of different angles. And that sort of spirit of collaboration is what's going to get things done. Yeah, so with that, that's actually all that I have. So I'd be more than happy to take any questions that you might have or comments. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen. So if you do have a question, please feel free to throw it in the chat or come off mute, please. No questions. I thoroughly solved all the problems here. It's like Todd has a question. Is there going to be a publication of the solar survey results as there was with the wind survey? Yeah, so that's the goal. So we have the solar survey published, the report itself published on the AFWA website. So there's a report that it's not a peer review publication, but the idea is to do similarly, get it in written up for some sort of publication like the TWS Wildlife Professional. There's another question here from Mona. Have you had solar companies or other stakeholders reach out since the survey came in? That's a great question. So one of the members of AFWA is the American Clean Power Association, which is the trade organization for renewable energy, for the renewable energy industry. And they've done a really great job of trying to engage with this and work with us in developing, that best management practice database and trying to help figure out how we can better facilitate communication between industry and agency representatives. So I haven't had any sort of specific solar companies reach out. And again, we just put this out on the website. We're working on what's the word? Marketing it, getting the word out. And so we're hoping that this can start getting into the hands of solar developers so they could see sort of what state agencies would like to see. Well, if there's no other questions, I again really appreciate everyone being here. And I think this will probably get posted to the YouTube channel here soon. So check that out. And if you're interested, I can send around the link for where you can find the solar survey. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good one.
Thanks, Megan. Great job.
Thanks, Megan.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.